Security, lock the doors, she's laundering money. The sentence didn't echo. It sliced through the marble lobby of Sterling National Bank like something rehearsed, something practiced, something that had been said before in rooms just like this, and every head turned at once, not toward the teller who said it, but toward the woman standing quietly at counter 3, because that's how it always worked. Accusation first, identity second, and in that moment Jada Sterling didn't move, didn't blink, didn't even tighten her grip on the modest leather tote resting against her hip, a bag that held exactly $20,000 in clean, counted bills, wrapped in standard bank bands. Nothing illegal, nothing hidden, just money. But the room didn't see money. It saw her, black, composed, dressed in a simple charcoal sweater and dark jeans that didn't signal wealth loud enough for the people trained to only recognize it in logos and labels. And that was the problem. Not the deposit, not the process, but the perception, the quiet assumption. Forming in real time like a verdict already written before any question was asked. And still she said nothing, because she had seen this before, not once, not twice, but enough times to recognize the rhythm of it, the shift in tone, the way politeness evaporated the second suspicion entered the air, the way procedure suddenly became personal, the way eyes narrowed not at the transaction, but at the person initiating it. And across the counter the teller, a woman in her mid-30s with a tight smile that never reached her eyes, tapped the screen once, then twice, as if the system itself might confirm what she already believed. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step aside," she said, louder now, louder than necessary, louder than policy required. And the word "ma'am" didn't soften anything. It sharpened it, turned it into something performative, something for the audience that had already begun to gather in glances and whispers. And Jada slowly lifted her eyes, calm, steady, anchored in a way that didn't match the tension building around her. "I'm making a deposit," she said, her voice even, measured, not defensive, not apologetic, just factual. But facts were already losing ground in a room that had chosen narrative over truth, because behind the counter the teller leaned back slightly, signaling to someone unseen, a subtle move, but intentional, and within seconds a second employee appeared, then a third, the escalation quiet but unmistakable, like a script unfolding exactly as designed. And somewhere to the left a man in a tailored navy suit muttered under his breath, not quite whispering, not quite speaking, 20 grand in cash? Yeah, right. And a soft ripple of agreement followed, not loud, not direct, just enough to fill the silence Jada refused to break. And still she stood there, unmoved, because this wasn't a surprise. This was a test, one she had initiated the moment she chose this branch. This day, this exact scenario, no assistant, no prior call, no executive signal, just her, walking in like any other customer. Because that was the point, to see what happened when power wasn't announced, when authority wasn't visible, when identity had to be respected before it was recognized. And right on cue the teller's voice rose again, sharper now, edged with certainty. "We've contacted security," she said. And this time the room didn't just watch, it leaned in, because something had shifted, something had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. And for the first time Jada reached into her pocket, not rushed, not reactive, just deliberate, pulling out her phone with the same composure she had carried from the moment she stepped through the glass doors, her thumb hovering for a fraction of a second before tapping a single contact. And when she spoke, her voice didn't carry anger, it carried control. "Log this," she said quietly, eyes still locked on the teller who had just turned a routine deposit into a public accusation. Every word, every action, starting now. The line stayed open on the other end of the phone for less than half a second before a voice answered, crisp, alert, already moving faster than the room Jada stood in. Confirmed, logging initiated, and just like that something invisible shifted, not in the lobby, not yet, but somewhere deeper, somewhere the teller could not see, because while the room was busy building its version of her, Jada Sterling had already begun building a record of them, and she slipped the phone back into her coat pocket without breaking eye contact, without raising her voice, without offering anything that could be mistaken for panic, because panic would have validated the narrative forming around her, and she had no intention of doing that. Not today, not in a building that carried her name in documents none of these people had ever read. and across the counter the teller straightened her posture as if emboldened by the silence. "Security is on the way," she repeated, louder this time, making sure the words landed, making sure the audience heard them clearly, and a man near the waiting chair shifted in his seat, angling his body just enough to watch more directly, while a woman beside him leaned closer, whispering something that ended with a quick glance at Jada's bag, and the assumptions multiplied quietly, efficiently, like interest on a bad investment. And then the manager appeared, not rushed, not uncertain, but deliberate, a man in his 40s with a pressed suit and a face that had learned how to turn suspicion into authority without ever raising its tone. He stepped beside the teller, glanced once at the screen, then at Jada, and in that brief pause the hierarchy became clear. The decision had already been made before he even spoke. "We are going to need documentation for the source of these funds," he said, voice smooth, controlled, but unmistakably firm, and the phrasing was careful, professional enough to sound reasonable, but pointed enough to signal doubt. And Jada tilted her head slightly, not in confusion, but in recognition, because she had heard this language before, different cities, different faces, same script. "It is a deposit," she replied, steady, each word placed exactly where it needed to be, no more, no less. And for a moment the manager's expression flickered, just slightly, not enough for most to notice, but enough for someone like her to catch, because what unsettled him was not what she said, it was how she said it, the absence of hesitation, the absence of apology, the absence of anything that matched the role they had already assigned her, and that disconnect created tension the room could not quite resolve. So it compensated, escalating instead of reassessing. "We are following protocol," the teller added quickly, as if reinforcing a structure that was beginning to crack, and that word protocol landed heavily, because it always did. It sounded neutral, objective, unquestionable, even when it was none of those things. And somewhere behind them a younger employee shifted uncomfortably, her eyes moving from Jada to the manager and back again, as if trying to reconcile what she was seeing with what she had been trained to believe. And then, almost under her breath, but not quiet enough to disappear, she said, "Her deposit slip is filled out correctly." A small sentence, simple, factual, but it cut through the noise for a second, just long enough to expose the gap between policy and perception, and the manager turned toward her with a look that did not need words to silence her. And just like that the moment closed, the system correcting itself, returning to its original trajectory. Because acknowledging doubt would mean admitting error, and that was not something this room was built to do. And Jada watched all of it unfold with the same stillness she had carried from the beginning. Because this was the point where most people broke, where voices rose, where frustration spilled over into something that could be labeled disruptive. But she did not give them that. She gave them nothing except presence, controlled, deliberate, unshaken. And that presence began to weigh on the room in a way no accusation could, because the longer she stood there without reacting, the harder it became to justify what they were doing. And yet they continued, because stopping now would mean confronting what had already been done. And then the faint sound of footsteps approached from the entrance, measured, official, and every head turned again, because the arrival of security did not just escalate the situation. It validated it in the eyes of those who needed confirmation, and the teller exhaled slightly, as if relief had finally arrived, while the manager adjusted his stance, preparing to hand off the situation as if it had always belonged to someone else. And Jada did not turn, did not step back, did not shift her weight even an inch, because she already knew what was coming next. She had seen this pattern play out too many times to mistake its direction, and still, beneath the calm, beneath the silence, something else was moving, not in the room, but beyond it. Something structured, something precise, something that did not rely on assumptions or raised voices, something already set in motion the second she said those two words, "Log this." The sound of polished shoes against marble carried a different kind of authority than the whispers that had filled the room moments before, steady, measured, trained, and when the two security officers stepped into view, their presence did not raise the volume of the space. It lowered it, because now everything felt official, documented, real, and the teller took a half step back as if handing over a problem she had already decided was solved. "That's her," she said, pointing without hesitation. without doubt. And in that single gesture, Jada Sterling was no longer a customer. She was a situation, something to be managed, contained, removed if necessary. And one of the officers nodded once, professional, neutral, but his eyes lingered just a second longer than expected, scanning not just her, but the room, the tension, the way people were watching, because even he could feel that something about this did not sit clean, and still procedure moved forward, because procedure always did. "Ma'am, we need you to step away from the counter," he said, voice calm, controlled. The kind of tone designed to sound reasonable even when the request itself was not. And Jada did not move, not out of defiance, not out of fear, but out of certainty, the kind that does not need to prove itself. "I am completing a deposit," she replied. The same sentence, the same tone, unchanged, and that repetition began to press against the structure they were trying to build around her, because repetition exposes inconsistency, and inconsistency creates doubt, and doubt is dangerous in a system that depends on unquestioned authority. And the manager stepped in again, quicker this time, as if sensing that control was slipping in ways he could not yet define. "She has refused to provide sufficient documentation," he said, directing his words not at Jada, but at the officers, framing the situation in terms that justified escalation. And the word refused hung in the air, heavy, misleading, because what had actually happened was something far quieter, far more subtle. But subtlety does not carry weight in moments like this. So it gets replaced with language that does. And near the edge of the room, a man lifted his phone slightly, not fully recording, not yet, but preparing, sensing that something worth capturing was unfolding, while the young employee from earlier stood frozen behind her station, her eyes fixed on Jada with a mixture of confusion and something else, something closer to realization. Because the longer this continued, the harder it became to ignore what was actually happening. And Jada saw it, not directly, but peripherally, the shift in awareness beginning to ripple through at least one person in the room. And that was enough, because change in spaces like this never starts loud. It starts small, almost invisible, a single doubt, a single question, and then it grows, and the officer closest to her adjusted his stance slightly, not aggressive, not confrontational, but uncertain now, just enough for it to register. "Ma'am, if you could just cooperate so we can clear this up," he added. Softer this time. And there it was, the first crack, because cooperation implies resolution, not removal. And Jada inclined her head just slightly, acknowledging the shift without giving ground. "Everything needed to clear this up is already here," she said. And her words did not rise, but they carried, because confidence has a way of filling space without asking permission. And behind her the low murmur of the room changed, not louder, but different, less certain, less unified, because what had started as a clear narrative was beginning to fracture under the weight of her stillness. And then, almost imperceptibly, a notification vibrated against the inside of her coat, not loud enough for others to hear, but enough for her to feel, a signal, precise, expected, and she did not reach for it immediately, did not rush to reveal anything, because timing mattered more than truth in moments like this. And truth delivered too early can be dismissed, ignored, overwritten, but truth delivered at the exact moment the system begins to doubt itself, that is when it lands, that is when it reshapes everything. And so she waited, not passively, but strategically, letting the room sit in its own uncertainty, letting the assumptions stretch just far enough to expose themselves completely. And across from her the teller shifted again, less confident now, her voice losing some of its earlier edge. "We are just trying to follow procedure," she said, almost defensively this time, as if the words needed reassurance. And Jada finally let her gaze settle fully on her, steady, unblinking, not hostile, not forgiving, just clear. "No," she said quietly, and the single word carried more weight than anything spoken so far. "You are not." And that is exactly what is being recorded. For a moment the room did not move, as if that single word had pressed pause on everything that had been building, and it was not loud, not dramatic, but it landed with a kind of precision that forced people to hear it whether they wanted to or not. Because what Jada Sterling had just done was not argue. She had corrected, and correction carries a different weight when it comes without emotion, without urgency, without any need for approval. and the teller's expression shifted, just slightly. The confidence she had been leaning on now flickering at the edges, because confidence requires certainty, and certainty had just been challenged in front of witnesses, and the manager felt it too, that subtle change in the room's alignment. The way attention was no longer automatically on his side. The way the narrative had stopped moving forward and begun to stall, and stalls are dangerous, because they give people time to think, and thinking leads to questions, and questions lead to accountability. And he stepped forward again, quicker now, sharper, trying to reclaim momentum before it slipped further. "Ma'am, you are escalating this situation unnecessarily," he said, and the phrasing was deliberate, designed to reposition her as the cause, to shift focus away from what had been done and onto how she was responding. But the problem was she was not responding the way the script required. She was not raising her voice, not stepping back, not giving them anything that could be labeled disruptive. And without that label, the accusation began to lose its foundation, and behind him the younger employees. Hands tightened slightly against the edge of her station, her eyes still fixed on Jada, but now there was no confusion there, only clarity forming in real time, because she had watched the entire sequence unfold from the beginning. The lack of greeting, the immediate suspicion, the escalation without cause, and now the attempt to rewrite it as protocol. And something in that realization pushed past hesitation. "She did not escalate anything," she said, her voice quiet but steady, and the words did not echo, but they did not disappear either. They hung in the space just long enough to be heard by the wrong people. And the manager turned toward her sharply, a warning already forming in his expression, but it came a second too late, because once something true is spoken out loud, it cannot be fully pulled back. It can only be ignored. And ignoring it now would only make it louder in the minds of everyone who had heard it. And a man near the chair shifted again, this time more openly, no longer pretending not to watch. And another customer leaned slightly to get a clearer view, because the scene had changed. It was no longer about a suspicious transaction. It was about how the situation was being handled, and that difference mattered more than anyone behind the counter wanted to admit. And Jada remained exactly where she had been, her posture unchanged, her expression unreadable but not empty. There was awareness there, calculation, timing, and she reached into her coat slowly, deliberately, not rushed, not reactive, and pulled out her phone again, not to prove anything, not yet, but to acknowledge something only she could see. The notification that had arrived moments earlier now confirmed, and she glanced at the screen just long enough to read a single line before locking it again. And when she spoke, her voice was just as calm as before, but now there was something else beneath it, something structured, something final beginning to take shape. "Internal review has started," she said, not to the manager, not to the teller, but to the room itself, because by now everyone was part of it whether they realized it or not. And the words did not sound like a threat. They sounded like a process, and process is harder to dismiss than emotion, because process does not need permission to continue. And the officer closest to her shifted again, this time more noticeably, his stance no longer fully aligned with the version of events he had been given, because what he was seeing did not match what he had been told, and that disconnect created space, small but significant, and the teller felt it, her voice returning but softer now, less certain. "We are just trying to protect the bank," she said, and this time the sentence did not carry authority, it carried justification. And justification is what people reach for when they begin to realize they might be wrong. And Jada looked at her, not with anger, not with sympathy, but with clarity that did not bend. "You are not protecting the bank," she said, each word placed with care. "You are exposing it." And that was the moment the room shifted completely, not loudly, not dramatically, but decisively, because exposure is not something systems are built to handle in real time. It is something they try to control after the fact, and now it was happening in front of everyone. And for the first time since the situation began, the manager did not speak immediately, because he was recalculating, adjusting, trying to understand something that no longer followed the pattern he expected. And Jada let the silence sit, just long enough. Because silence now worked in her favor, it gave weight to what had already been said, and somewhere beyond the glass doors of the bank, unseen but already in motion, the next phase of that process was arriving, not with noise, not with urgency, but with authority that did not need to announce itself, because it was already recognized the moment it entered the room. The air did not tighten all at once. It settled, heavy and deliberate, like something unseen had entered the room and taken its place without asking. And for the first time since the situation began, no one rushed to fill the silence, because what Jada Sterling had just said did not invite argument. It demanded reflection, and reflection was not something this space was comfortable with, not when it exposed more than it protected, and the manager's jaw shifted slightly as he recalibrated. His confidence no longer anchored in certainty, but in control, and control was slipping, not visibly, not dramatically, but in the small ways that matter most, in hesitation, in delayed responses, in the way his next words took just a fraction longer to form. "Ma'am, you are creating a disruption," he said finally, and the sentence sounded thinner than the ones before it, less like authority and more like an attempt to reclaim it, because the room had already begun to question that claim. And a disruption requires imbalance, requires noise, requires resistance. And Jada had given them none of that. She stood exactly where she had been, composed, still, her presence now the most stable thing in the entire space. And that stability was beginning to expose everything else as unstable, inconsistent, forced, and the officer nearest to her glanced briefly toward the manager, not for instruction, but for confirmation, and when it did not come immediately, that glance lingered just long. Enough to signal doubt, and doubt in uniform carries weight, because it spreads quietly, quickly, without needing to be spoken, and near the counter the younger employee stepped forward just a few inches, not enough to draw full attention, but enough to break her own silence. "She has not raised her voice," she said, and this time her tone held more than observation. It held conviction, because the longer this continued the harder it became to justify the narrative being presented, and the teller exhaled sharply, frustration beginning to replace certainty. "That is not the point," she said, but the words lacked structure, lacked grounding, because if it was not the point, then what was? And no one answered, not immediately, because the truth was already present and no one on that side of the counter wanted to say it out loud. And Jada's eyes moved once across the room, not searching, not reacting, just observing, taking in the shift that had begun to ripple outward. The way people were no longer just watching her, they were watching them. And that reversal, subtle as it was, changed everything, because scrutiny had changed direction, and scrutiny makes performance harder to sustain, and the manager felt it, the weight of it, the awareness that whatever happened next would not just be witnessed, it would be remembered, and possibly recorded in ways he could not control, and still he pushed forward, because retreat now would mean admission, and admission would mean consequence. "If you do not comply, we will have to ask you to leave," he said. And there it was, the final escalation before removal, the line drawn clearly enough for everyone to see. And yet it did not land the way it was supposed to, because compliance requires legitimacy, and legitimacy had already begun to erode. And Jada did not step back, did not argue, did not even respond immediately, because response would have been expected, and she had moved beyond expectation, and instead she reached into her bag, slowly, deliberately, and placed the deposit envelope on the counter, aligning it with precision, as if resetting the entire situation back to what it was supposed to be, a simple transaction, and that action, quiet as it was, carried more power than any raised voice could have, because it refused to acknowledge the false narrative being built around it. And for a moment no one moved, not the teller, not the manager, not the officers, because the simplicity of that gesture exposed the complexity they had created, and complexity is harder to defend when it is unnecessary. And then her phone vibrated again, stronger this time, not louder, but more insistent, and she did not ignore it, did not delay. She took it out, glanced once, and this time the shift in her expression was almost imperceptible, but it was there, a confirmation, a transition, the moment where observation ends and action begins. And when she spoke, her voice did not change in volume, but it changed in weight. "They are here," she said, and the words did not carry urgency. They carried arrival, and for a brief second the room seemed to hold its breath, not because anyone fully understood what she meant, but because something in the way she said it made it clear that whatever was coming next was not part of the version of events they had been constructing, and beyond the glass doors the reflection of movement appeared, not chaotic, not rushed, but coordinated, deliberate, and unmistakably different from the kind of presence that had entered earlier, and the manager turned slightly, just enough to see it. And in that moment something in his posture shifted, not visibly to everyone, but enough to matter, because recognition had begun, and recognition changes everything before a single word is even spoken. The glass doors did not swing open with urgency. They parted with intention, smooth and controlled, and the difference was immediate, because the presence that entered was not reactive. It was expected, even if no one in the room had expected it. And three individuals stepped inside, not in uniform, not with raised voices, but with the kind of quiet authority that does not need introduction, tailored suits, measured pace, eyes already scanning the room not for threat, but for truth. And the manager's posture shifted again, more noticeably this time, his shoulders tightening just enough to betray recognition before he could fully mask it, because he knew, not who they were exactly, but what they represented, and that realization moved through him faster than anything he could say, and beside him the teller straightened instinctively, her earlier certainty now replaced with something closer to alertness, because authority had entered that did not belong to her, and Jada Sterling did not turn to greet them, did not acknowledge them with anything more than stillness, because acknowledgement was not necessary. Not when everything had already been set in motion long before they walked through those doors, and the lead among them, a woman with a calm expression and a presence that carried weight without effort, stepped forward, her gaze moving once across the counter, then settling briefly on Jada, not with surprise, not with confusion, but with confirmation, and then she turned to the manager. "We need a moment," she said, her voice level, precise, not loud, but it carried in a way that made the room listen, and the manager hesitated, just for a second, caught between the structure he had been enforcing and the one now standing in front of him. And hesitation in leadership is visible. It ripples outward. It signals uncertainty, and the officers near Jada noticed it too, their stance adjusting almost imperceptibly, no longer fully aligned with the instructions they had been given, because authority had just shifted, not announced, but recognized, and the teller glanced quickly between the manager and the new arrivals, searching for direction, for reassurance, but neither came immediately, and that absence spoke louder than any command, and the woman in the suit did not repeat herself, did not raise her voice. She simply waited, because she did not need to push. The situation was already moving in her direction, and finally the manager nodded once, a small gesture, but it carried concession, and he stepped slightly aside, creating space that had not existed moments before, and the woman took a step closer to the counter, her attention returning briefly to Jada, and in that brief exchange something passed between them, not spoken, not obvious, but clear enough for anyone paying close attention, recognition, alignment, understanding, and then she turned back to the staff. "All interactions from this point forward are to be paused," she said, and the phrasing was deliberate, not a request, not a suggestion, a directive, and it landed differently than anything that had been said before, because it did not rely on justification, it relied on position, and position does not need to explain itself, and the room responded in kind, the quiet deepening, the movement slowing, because when a higher structure enters, the lower one adjusts, whether it wants to or not, and the younger employee's eyes widened slightly, her earlier uncertainty now replaced with something closer to realization, because she could see it now. The shift in hierarchy, the change in tone, the way the manager no longer led the moment, and Jada remained still, her presence unchanged, but now the space around her felt different, not because she had moved, but because everything else had, and the officer nearest to her took a small step back, not retreating, but repositioning, acknowledging the change without needing to announce it, and the teller's voice, when it came, was quieter, less certain. "Is there an issue?" she asked, and the question, simple as it was, revealed everything, because moments ago she had been the one defining the issue, and now she was asking if one existed, and the woman in the suit looked at her, not unkindly, but without softness. "There is," she said, "and it is being reviewed." And that word, reviewed, settled into the room with finality, because review implies oversight, and oversight implies accountability. And accountability was not something this situation had been built to withstand, and Jada finally shifted, just slightly, not stepping away, not stepping forward, but turning her gaze toward the manager, her expression calm, but now unmistakably decisive. And when she spoke, her voice did not rise, but it carried through the silence with clarity that could not be ignored. "You had the opportunity to handle this correctly," she said, and the sentence did not accuse, it stated. And statements are harder to argue than accusations, because they do not seek reaction, they define reality. And the manager opened his mouth to respond, but the words did not come immediately, because the structure he had relied on was no longer holding. And for the first time since the moment began, he was no longer controlling the narrative, he was inside it. Silence did not fall all at once, it settled in layers, each second pressing deeper than the last. Because now the room understood that something irreversible had begun, not loud, not chaotic, but precise, controlled, and far beyond anything that could be undone with a simple explanation. And the manager stood there, caught between instinct and realization, his authority no longer anchored in position but suspended in uncertainty. And for the first time his eyes moved not to the teller, not to the officers, but back to Jada Sterling, searching, recalculating, trying to understand how the ground beneath him had shifted without warning. And Jada met that look. Without resistance, without triumph, just clarity. Because this moment was never about surprise, it was about exposure. And exposure does not need volume, it needs timing. And the woman in the suit stepped slightly to the side, creating a line of sight that connected Jada directly to the entire room, as if the space itself had rearranged to center the truth. And Jada took one slow step forward, not aggressive, not dramatic, but deliberate, and the sound of her shoes against the floor seemed louder now, not because it was, but because everything else had gone quiet enough to hear it. And when she spoke, her voice did not rise, it did not need to, because it carried something far more powerful than volume. It carried certainty. "You called security," she said, her eyes moving from the teller to the manager, not accusing, not emotional, just stating. "You questioned my money, you questioned my intent, and you questioned whether I belong here." And each phrase landed separately, not rushed, not combined, because weight requires space, and space allows people to feel what is being said, and no one interrupted, not because they agreed, but because they could not, because interruption requires confidence, and confidence had already begun to collapse. And she paused for just a fraction of a second, not long, but long enough for the room to absorb the pattern, the sequence, the structure of what had just happened. And then she finished, her voice just as steady as before. "In a bank that I own." And the words did not echo, they settled, heavy, undeniable, and for a moment nothing moved. Not the teller, not the manager, not the officers, because the sentence had done what no escalation could. It had shifted reality, and reality, once shifted, cannot be returned to its previous state. And the teller blinked once, then again. Her expression no longer aligned with the confidence she had carried at the beginning, because certainty cannot survive contradiction when the contradiction is true. And the manager's posture changed completely now, not subtly, not gradually, but all at once. The structure he had relied on dissolving in real time, because the authority he thought he held had just been revealed as conditional, temporary, dependent on assumptions that no longer applied. And the officers stepped back fully now, not retreating, but repositioning in a way that acknowledged the new hierarchy without needing instruction. And the younger employee's hand moved to her mouth, not out of shock, but out of recognition, because the pieces had finally aligned, and everything she had sensed earlier now had a name. And Jada did not raise her voice, did not demand anything, because she did not need to. The room was already responding, already shifting, already recalibrating around the truth that had just been spoken. And the woman in the suit inclined her head slightly, not in approval, but in confirmation, as if marking the exact moment the process transitioned from observation to consequence. And the manager tried to speak, his lips parting, his voice beginning to form, but the words did not come easily, because explanation requires footing, and his had already disappeared. And Jada watched him, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with a calm that made the moment even heavier. Because calm in the face of collapse does not escalate, it defines, and when she spoke again, it was not louder, not sharper, but clearer. You did not verify, you did not ask, you decided, she said, and each word was placed with precision, not to accuse, but to document, to mark the sequence exactly as it had occurred. And that is what made it final. Because once something is documented, it no longer belongs to interpretation, it belongs to record, and record does not forget. And the room felt it, the shift from situation to evidence, from assumption to accountability. And in that moment, the power did not change hands dramatically. It simply revealed where it had always been. And for the first time since the doors had opened that morning, Sterling National Bank did not feel like a place of authority. It felt like a place being evaluated by it. The silence did not break with noise. It shifted with consequence, quiet at first, almost invisible, but unmistakable once it began, because systems do not collapse loudly. They correct themselves, and the first sign of that correction came not from Jada Sterling, not from the manager, but from the woman in the suit who had entered without introduction and now held the room without effort. She stepped forward slightly, her gaze moving across the counter with calm precision, and when she spoke, her voice did not rise, but it carried authority that did not need to be explained. Effective immediately, all involved personnel are to step away from their stations, she said, and the phrasing left no room for interpretation, no space for delay, and the teller froze for a fraction of a second, her hand still resting near the keyboard that had moments ago felt like control, but now felt like exposure, and the manager opened his mouth again, this time not to defend, but to recover something. Anything. There must be some misunderstanding, he said, but the sentence fell flat before it could land, because misunderstanding requires ambiguity, and there was none left. Everything had been seen, heard, documented, and now confirmed, and the woman in the suit did not respond to him directly. She did not need to. Instead, she turned slightly, addressing someone behind her. Initiate compliance review on this branch. Full audit, immediate priority. And the words moved through the space like a final decision already signed, because this was not escalation anymore. This was execution of process, and process does not pause for discomfort. And the officers who had been called earlier now stood fully back, their role complete, their presence no longer needed in a situation that had outgrown the version of authority they represented, and the younger employee stepped back from her station slowly, not out of fear, but out of recognition, because she understood now that what she had witnessed was not just a moment. It was a turning point, and near the waiting area, the man who had lifted his phone earlier now held it openly, not hiding, not hesitating, because what was happening no longer belonged to speculation, it belonged to reality, and reality, once revealed, demands to be seen, and the teller finally moved, her hands pulling away from the counter, her posture no longer aligned with certainty, but with consequence, and the manager's shoulders lowered slightly, not in defeat, but in acknowledgement, because there is a moment in every collapse where resistance stops making sense, and that moment had arrived. And Jada Sterling did not move forward, did not claim space, because she did not need to. The space was already shifting toward her, aligning with her, correcting itself around her presence, and the deposit envelope still sat on the counter exactly where she had placed it, unchanged, untouched, a quiet reminder of what this had always been. A simple transaction that had been turned into something else entirely, and now, just as quietly, it was being returned to its original truth, and the woman in the suit glanced once more at Jada, a brief, professional acknowledgement, not of status, but of alignment, because this was no longer about identity, it was about standard, and standards do not bend, they reveal, and the system behind them either holds or it does not, and today it had not, and that failure was now being addressed in real time, not with anger, not with spectacle, but with precision, and the manager stepped back fully now, clearing the space in front of the counter, no longer occupying a position he could not justify, and the teller followed, her earlier voice gone, replaced by silence that carried far more weight than anything she had said before, and Jada finally reached forward, not hurried, not reactive, and gently adjusted the envelope once more, aligning it again with the edge of the counter, as if resetting the moment back to its intended purpose. And when she spoke, her voice remained calm, But now it carried something final, something that did not seek response, only recognition. Finish the transaction, she said, and the instruction was simple, direct, exactly what it had been from the beginning. But now it landed differently, because now it came from a place that had been revealed, not assumed, and the room understood, not just who she was, but what had just happened, because this was never about $20,000. It was about what people saw when they thought no one was watching, and what happened when the person they misjudged turned out to be the one defining the standard they had just failed. No one rushed to move, because movement now required permission from a standard that had just been reestablished, and for a moment the entire lobby existed in a kind of suspended clarity, the kind that follows truth when it lands without distortion. And then, slowly, the system began to correct itself, not loudly, not dramatically, but in the small, precise ways that define real change. A different teller stepped forward from the adjacent station, her posture careful, respectful, not performative but aware, and she did not question, did not hesitate. She simply reached for the envelope Jada Sterling had placed on the counter and said, "I can assist you with your deposit." Her voice steady, professional, exactly what it should have been from the beginning, and that difference was not lost on anyone in the room, because now everyone could see the contrast, not just in behavior, but in intention, and Jada gave a single nod, not as approval, but as acknowledgement, because this was never about individual redemption, it was about restoring a standard that should never have been broken. And the transaction began, keys pressed, amounts verified, processes followed. Exactly as written, no added suspicion, no unnecessary questions, just the quiet rhythm of a system functioning the way it was designed to. And that normalcy, after everything that had just happened, felt heavier than any confrontation could have, because it exposed how simple this moment had always been, and how complicated it had been made. And behind the counter the manager stood still, no longer directing, no longer intervening, his role reduced to observation, and that shift was not announced, it was understood, because authority had already been reassigned by truth, not by title, and the teller who had initiated everything remained silent, her earlier voice replaced by reflection that did not need to be spoken to be seen, and the younger employee watched closely, not just the transaction, but the process, the correction, the way the system could either fail or function depending on the choices made within it. And something in that observation settled into her, something that would not leave when the moment ended, because moments like this do not disappear, they reshape. And the woman in the suit remained near the edge of the counter, her presence steady, ensuring that what had begun would be carried through, not just today, but beyond it, because review does not end with acknowledgement, it continues until structure changes. And Jada stood quietly as the receipt printed, the soft mechanical sound cutting through the silence with finality, and when it was handed to her she took it with the same calm she had carried from the start, no added emphasis, no gesture of victory, because this was not about winning, it was about alignment, and she placed the receipt into her bag, turned slightly, and for the first time since she had entered the bank, she addressed the room, not loudly, not dramatically, but clearly enough for those who had watched to understand. This was never about the money, she said, her voice even, her tone grounded in something deeper than the moment itself. It was about what you assumed before you knew anything at all, and the words settled into the space with a different kind of weight, not corrective, but reflective, because now the room had to sit with what it had seen, what it had allowed, what it had almost justified, and she let the silence follow, just long enough for that understanding to take hold. And then she added, just as calmly, just as precisely, "I did not raise my voice, I did not argue, I did not prove anything. I let you show me exactly how this system works when you think no one important is watching." And that sentence did not accuse, it revealed, and revelation does not need force, it needs truth. And the room absorbed it fully now, because there was no structure left to deflect it, no assumption strong enough to deny it. And Jada adjusted her coat slightly, not as a gesture of closure, but of continuation, because for her this was not the end, it was part of something larger, something that would extend far beyond this lobby. And as she turned toward the exit, the space parted naturally, not out of obligation, but out of recognition, because now everyone understood what they had witnessed, not just a correction, but a standard being reasserted in real time. and as the doors opened and she stepped out into the daylight, the bank behind her did not feel the same, not because it had changed completely, but because it had been seen clearly, and once something is seen clearly, it can never return to being invisible again.